everybody. Thanks for coming out. I feel like a little kid in this chair. I also feel like a little kid because I'm here with Jenette Kahn, and I am so excited about this.
And I'm so excited to be interviewed by a woman in comics.
The perfect segue to start. So, women in comics, and also paired with being 28 years old and getting in this high-profile position in comics. So I wasn't going to get to this until later, but let's talk about this right now. So what was that like starting, I mean, you'd already been publishing for a while, so obviously that's why you were ending up at DC Comics. But can you talk about what that was like, starting at that age in a position like that in a world of men?
Well, Liz is quite right. It was a world of men, and still predominantly is, because we were manufacturing male fantasy. And our artists were drawing all the men that they wanted to be and all the women they wanted to be with. And there were only 2 women on staff when I came to DC, but we were a small organization, 35 people. And as Liz says, you know, I was 28, and of course I was a woman, and I was from outside the industry. So there was a lot of fear and loathing when I came to DC. And someone who became one of my favorite editors, Joe Orlando, was said to be throwing up in the men's room when he heard I was hired.
Throwing up in the men's room?
Yes.
Wow. Okay, could I also mention that this is the late 70s?
That's
too.
right, 1976.
So, do you remember your first day?
Not really, no.
No.
But perhaps I've blocked it, but I did come on Groundhog's Day, and I've always said that I saw my shadow and stayed forever.
Wow, that's so Jungian. So, well, let's just move on to the first slide. Okay, so this is, what this slide is this is Andy Warhol's take on Kurt Swan's drawing
Yes.
of Superman hung in your office. So let's talk about this. Tell me why you like this piece.
Well, for me, it was the perfect fusion of what we were doing at DC and for my interest also in so-called fine art. But I saw comics as an art form, and I think in some ways this piece legitimated comics as an art form. And I was also a big Warhol fan, and so it was really kind of a privilege to have this in my office.
That's great. That's great. Well, and also we were talking about this before. Your parents were art enjoyers also, but that they didn't see Warhol as being like a very good representative artist of the finer arts.
Well, my parents and I, when I was young, went to a very, very early Warhol show. And you know, the Brillo boxes were there, and the Coke bottles with different amounts of Coke in them. And they're like, this is not art. I mean, this is, you know, a scam upon the public. The manufactured look, again, the pop imagery. And I thought, oh, they are so wrong. These are so beautiful. And it was a generational divide, really.
And that is, I can't help but think about when people talk about comics. There's a similar discussion.
Well, I must say, comic book artists were not happy with Warhol or with Lichtenstein or any of the pop artists, because they said they took our imagery and we got paid page rate, and they were getting paid, you know, thousands and then ultimately millions of dollars for our art, because as Liz said, this is a Kurt Swan drawing. Kurt was one of the most famous Superman artists, really drew an iconic Superman, and they didn't allow for what the appropriation meant in terms of changing the image in terms of scale, the diamond dust, the ghost image, the manufactured look. But it was interesting, once I walked into Blum-Hellman Gallery in New York, and I wandered into the back room, and there were some very, very early Lichtensteins, and Blum came out and said, like, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm just so interested because a lot of these images are from our comics. And he said, wait a second. He said, I have the comics with the frames, the panels cut out. And I said, wait, I have the panels. It was a kind of a marriage of Swiss cheese in the holes.
All right, so this next slide is, as you can see, it says, beginning June 1st, the DC, oh, wait a minute, I have a laser pointer. All right. All right, playing with toys. Okay, so beginning June 1st, the DC explosion, more pages, more stories, and the most exciting superheroes in comics. Watch for full details next month. So when you started at DC, there was the DC explosion,
which led very swiftly to the DC implosion.
So let's talk about that. So whose idea was it to kill a bunch of characters and then restart it?
Well, that's somewhat different. That's Crisis on Infinite Earths. But prior to that, as I mentioned earlier, I really saw comics as an art form. And when I came to DC, comics were considered this disposable, ephemeral medium for kids. And I thought we had to change a lot of the parameters so that comics would be given the respect that I felt they were due. And one of the things had to do with pricing, because comics, I think when I got to DC, were 15 cents maybe, or 25 cents, something very low. And they hadn't kept up with inflation, and that also added to its disposable quality. And so I thought one of the things, if we could raise cover prices, that would be a start on the many, many kinds of changes that we had to do to get comics accepted as an art form. So I thought, all right, dollar comics, all this material, but the truth of the matter was the material wasn't very good, and it didn't justify the dollar price other than in page count, but not in terms of content. So it was an experiment a little too early, and we really had to change the content over time and production values over time to justify what became the higher prices.
And part of the change, too, was getting rid of the ads in there, right?
Well, some comics carried ads, but some, of course, didn't. And trade paperbacks, graphic novels, of course, over time, we did get rid of the ads. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, in Mad Magazine, which I also oversaw, we began to take ads. So, but that was to justify the color in Mad, which we certainly needed after 50 years of black and white.
Let's talk a little bit about Mad. So, what would you like to share with us about some of your experiences at Mad Magazine?
Oh, well, just to be working with the usual gang of idiots, there was just no greater honor than that. But I noticed that I only got to take over Mad when Bill Gaines, who was this wonderful, totally eccentric founder, died. And Bill had King Kong climbing up the window of his office. He had Zeppelins overhead, and he weighed about 350 pounds and had gray hair down to his shoulders. And back when men had to wear ties, he would never wear a tie. And he made a deal with a restaurant down the block from him that he would eat there every single day if he didn't have to wear a tie. And they said yes. And so I have so many great Bill stories, but I guess that's too much of a digression. But anyway, I was a very lucky ducky who got to oversee Mad when Bill died. But I noticed that I was never parodied in the magazine. And I said, you guys, you haven't accepted me yet. You don't trust me. I haven't been satirized. And eventually, it took a long time, eventually I started to appear in the pages, and then I knew it was okay.
Do you feel like maybe they didn't want to satirize you because they were like, woman in the...
It's possible.
Yeah. But the fact that you knew you were accepted when they satirized you, that's really interesting. Because it's like when you're a kid and you get made fun of as a girl, and your mom is like, well, really, those boys just like you.
That's how I felt.
All right. Aha. Okay, so this is Static Shock #1. And this was on one of the imprints of Vertigo being the more sort of edgy DC Comics,
it was
right?
its own independent imprint. It
wasn't
okay. Part of Vertigo.
Oh, it wasn't, okay. But it was an imprint of DC.
Of DC's. It's called Milestone.
Right. What is interesting about this is that minorities were some of the less represented groups in comics, and that this imprint and the titles that were issued by it were relevant to people who were less represented in comics. So maybe you can talk about that.
Well, Liz is absolutely right. There were almost no characters of color in comic books, certainly when I came to DC. And Of course, it doesn't represent our society, but it also didn't inspire other possible artists and writers to think they could find a home at DC if they weren't even portrayed in our comics. And some really talented writers and artists who all have very diverse ethnic backgrounds came and said, we would like to do this imprint called Milestone, and all of the characters will be characters of color. And it seemed like a terrific idea, and the comics were really wonderful. And Static Shock here became a TV show, actually an animated TV show. Unfortunately, again, it might have been something too early because the line did not succeed over time, and so we had to fold it. But you know, it was out there for several years, and some really good comics were published under its aegis.
Great, great. All right, Arkham Asylum. So I believe this was from the 15th anniversary edition. So this was Grant Morrison working with Dave McKean.
Yes.
Very occulty, and part of the, I can't imagine I'm the only person that calls this, but the British invasion of going over to England and recruiting artists to then be part of the Vertigo.
Yes, I have to say, well, we were publishing comics that hadn't yet achieved the sort of level that I thought we could. British artists and writers were ahead of us. So we started making trips to England to pirate them. And some of the best comics came out of our trips to England, and Vertigo ultimately came out of our trips to England. I have to give just huge props to Karen Berger, who came with me on one of those trips, and then of her own volition organized an entire booklet of all the artists we'd seen and all the writers and their work and recommendations. And I said, I think you should head Vertigo. And she was just Vertigo's incredible editor for 20 years. But Grant Morrison has one of the most interesting minds known to humankind. And you can see this is kind of a hallucinogenic cover from Dave McKean, but the entire Arkham Asylum is hallucinogenic. And Grant talks about his influences, that they included Jung and Lewis Carroll. And you can certainly, if you've read Arkham Asylum, you know it's a trip down the rabbit hole. And we started to take a lot of risks and to say, the content didn't have to be, even if it's a superhero character, it doesn't have to follow the parameters of the upright superhero or the macho superhero. We could explore a lot of dark areas.
And also, as long as we're on the topic of actually, back up. Grant Morrison made enough money on this to go off and have his alien experiences and his weirdo stuff. And money's a weird topic, but let's just dive into it. So the interesting thing about some of the titles that Vertigo did was that they investigated some of the sort of more like experimental topics, but the audience was ready for it. People were buying. People were. This was successful. That is something that I'm not sure that was common in the comics world.
One of the great things about comics is that the price of entry is fairly low, especially if you compare it to film. And we were publishing 80 titles a month, so we could take some flyers because we knew that we had enough mainstream titles that could carry the weight of it. And there was nothing more exciting than being able to greenlight titles that might have been risky, but we thought had just tremendous artistic resonance and hoped would find an audience, and so often they did, because they had real integrity and because they were not your mother's comic book.
Right. Okay, actually, let's come back. We'll come back to Sandman, because I want to get to Ronin. Okay, so this is important. This particular publishing, fancier paper, different type of printing, perfect binding. Let's talk about that.
Ronin is sort of the beginning of the new golden age at DC, because Frank Miller was working over at Marvel, and he was doing Daredevil. And I was looking across the street at Marvel, and especially Daredevil, thinking, feeling extremely jealous. And so I thought, how am I going to lure Frank over to DC? So I asked him to have lunch with me, and I said, what would you ideally like to do in comics? If there were no barriers whatsoever, what would you want to do? And he said, well, I have this idea about a Ronin, and I'm like this huge Japanese samurai film fan. So I'm like, oh, Ronin, what a great idea. and then he said, but I want to do this on beautiful paper. And we were publishing, with very, very rare exceptions, entirely on newsprint. And but meanwhile, while we're publishing on newsprint, in Europe, they're publishing what are called albums on really gorgeous paper with gorgeous art. And I know that Frank was looking, as I was looking across to Marvel, he's looking across to Europe and thinking, I'm really jealous. And so he said, I want to do that. And because we were publishing on newsprint, all of our separations, the color separations, were mechanically done. But if you couldn't do a painting and separate it mechanically, but you could photographically. So Frank said, I want to have the pages painted, and he was draw, and his wife at the time, Lynn Varley, would do the painting. He said, so I want to paint them, so it has to be photographic separation. And I don't think Ronin was perfect binding. We hadn't gotten to perfect binding yet, but
saddle stitch.
Saddle stitch. But I said, okay, let me go see if we can do that. And we put our heads together, and we figured out a way to do this, and it was beautiful, really beautiful, and that led to The Dark Knight Returns, and then to one extraordinary title after another.
Speaking of The Dark Knight Returns. So actually, before we jump into this, so were the Marvel and DC offices like right across?
Oh, no,
from
just
each other?
conceptually.
No, oh, okay. It wasn't like you guys would go toe to toe in the street and like,
No, we did have, Superman versus Spider-Man, but team-ups like that.
Mashup, yeah. So Frank Miller, Dark Knight Returns. Also, just so the audience knows, a perfect binding, when we talk about that, means that it's a book that's the way most books are bound, and that's like the technical name for it.
It's when a book has a spine, so you could actually put it on your bookshelf and you could read the title on the spine.
All right, so Dark Knight Returns, and what was the sort of discussion with Frank Miller up to this, and talk about some of the decisions that were made that The Dark Knight Returns ended up making it what it was.
One of the things that we tried to say, and Ronin was really the beginning of that, is we support creators. And that meant many things. It meant, which we can get into later if you want, or now, creators' rights.
Do it.
Okay, so when I came to DC, and this was true across the industry, creators had absolutely no rights whatsoever in the creations. And they had no royalties, they had no reprint payments, they had no guarantee of the return of their artwork, they had no share of any ancillary income from movies or merchandise or television. And most humiliating of all, when they went to endorse their checks, on the back of the check was a stamp that basically gave DC all the rights throughout the cosmos in perpetuity to their creations. So I said, no, this is just so wrong, and we'll never move DC, aside from the fact that it's ethically so wrong, but we'll never turn DC into the publishing house that I believed it could be if we aren't going to solicit the best material from creators. And why should they ever give us their best material if we have these draconian rules? And so we worked out ways to try to give royalties, to guarantee, of course, artwork back and reprint payments. But the biggest hurdle, because luckily comics at that point in Time Warner, and so back in the day it was Warner Communications, comics, nobody looked microscopically at DC Comics. It was like, oh, comics. So we could do a lot of things under the radar and be sort of a fifth column. But when it came to giving a share of the revenue of movies and television and merchandise, that needed corporate approval. And there was no comic book union pressuring us to do that, no one threatening strikes. And comic book artists and writers, because they needed, of course, to get paid, were working on our characters that we owned, like Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, the Flash, Green Arrow, Hawkman. But I truly believe they had wonderful ideas in the drawer that they were never going to show us. And so I basically said to corporate, wouldn't you rather own 50% of something than 100% of nothing, and ultimately that argument held the day. And so when we started to do things like that, when we started to show our artists and writers that we really would support their ideas and their like Frank's request for Ronin, and then when he came in and said, "Well, this really out there idea for Batman, and you know, Batman's going to kind of be a fascist, and Superman's going to be a shill for the government." We're like, okay. So and that's so believing in creators' rights, and it took time. You know, even though we implemented them fairly early, it took time for creators to realize that we weren't going to take the rights away. And we were showing consistently our support for the art and for the writing. And then we also changed our distribution system, because when I came to DC, almost all of our comic books were sold on the newsstand, which is the worst business you could possibly imagine, because you printed basically 4 comics to sell 1. And often newsstand dealers, because it was less expensive, wouldn't even send the comics back that didn't sell. They just sent back like a third of the cover. And meanwhile, as it was just, you know, it really was literally and metaphorically a business of diminishing returns, or maybe escalating returns and diminishing returns at the same time. And there was this very infant comic book store business. And comic book stores were starting to spring up around the country of people who loved comics and just didn't want to give them up. And we thought, that's the future, but how can we really bet on this when they're kind of fly-by-night stores? They have no financial stability, but they need to have money to grow. And we figured out, I actually brought in a consultant. I shouldn't say we figured out, because I had to bring in a consultant who knew this area and I didn't. But and also with Paul Levitz, who was executive vice president, really my partner at DC. And he worked very closely with Leon Nyes, our consultant, to figure out a credit plan where we could extend credit to these comic book stores, but not, if they tanked, not go down with them. And ultimately, that really helped the direct market to grow. And so we were able to print to order. The comic book stores would send in their orders, and we would print accordingly. And we didn't have returns. And this enabled us, of course, to spend much more money on comics and do the beautiful paper and the photographic separations and pay our artists and writers more.
And also, I should mention, as someone who works in a independently owned store that sells comics, I am very appreciative to that system. And I also do know that many of the sort of glossier magazines still operate under that similar system of, if the previous issue didn't sell, you tear off the cover and you send it back for credit.
Yes.
And which means that you're ruining perfectly nice
also true.
Art
and a lot of trees.
Yeah. All right. So, one of the reasons that you are so familiar with creators' rights is having been a creator yourself, having published magazines before getting into comics, and one of them was Dynamite. I thought you might enjoy seeing that this particular issue goes for how much on eBay? $1,239.99.
I should have kept more of them.
Do you have a stash, a secret stash of them anywhere?
Not really. I just probably have just a few. In fact, I was telling Liz, I was meeting with an agent in Hollywood a couple of weeks ago, and he said, "Well, how did you become the head of DC Comics?" And I said, "Well, I published several magazines. I started several magazines before coming." And he said, "Well, what were they?" And when I said Dynamite, he's like, "Oh my God, Dynamite! I loved it so. It was my favorite magazine. I couldn't wait for it to come." So I thought, well, I should really send him a copy, and I had to buy it on eBay.
How much did you pay?
Nothing like that.
1,000?
Nothing like that.
Who was like the weirdest person in the 80s to work with on the magazine? Like any of the stars that were in it, or interviews, or?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, comic books. Well, nerddom is welcome in comic book companies. So I think we were all kind of a little crazy.
Sure. Well, any creator has a creative side. Sometimes is kind of crazy. All right, so what this is so this is from the Double Nickel Entertainment website, and I believe this is a shot from one of the trailers that is on the site for The Flock. So let's talk about what you're doing now. So in the movie industry, and can you talk about your transition from comics into the world of cinema?
Well, I was the head of DC Comics for 27 years, and it was the best job in the galaxy. And I worked with the most wonderful people. I loved the medium, but after 27 years, I needed the challenge of a learning curve again. And I thought, what do I know how to do? What transferable skills do I have? And I realized, not many. But, but I thought, I do know how to tell stories in pictures and words, so maybe I could be a producer. And I couldn't call anybody at Warner Brothers since I was still working in the company at that time, but I called someone named Adam Richman, whom I had met when he was at the Harvard Business School, and he'd asked me to come speak there. And I couldn't make the dates, but I'd called to thank him. And he was so nice on the telephone. I said, oh, come look me up when you come to New York sometime. And he took me at my word, and he came, and he had this idea. He was graduating, that maybe he could represent the DC characters. And I said, you know, I actually do that as part of my job, but you represent them in Hollywood. But I'd like to meet him more in person. So I said, I'll help you get a job. And I wrote letters of recommendation and called people on his behalf, and he never forgot. So he would come to New York, he'd take me out to dinner, and now he'd been working in the film business for about 6 or 7 years. So I thought, I'll call Adam. And I call him, and he goes, oh, I'm so happy to hear from you, but I'm just going into the movies. Can I call you tomorrow? And I really wanted to ask him, you know, what do you need for a production company? Do you need capital? What kind of staff? And now just as shorthanded, I said, absolutely, we can talk tomorrow. I just want to talk to you about a production company. And he goes, great, I'm there. And I'm hanging up the phone going, great, I'm there? Great, I'm there? That is so not what I meant. But then I thought, maybe I just got really, really lucky. So we started to talk about partnering, and we've been partners now for a number of years. And I definitely had a learning curve. It was much steeper than I ever anticipated. But I love it. I love the creative process. And you know, I guess this movie is from The Flock, which we made with Richard Gere and Claire Danes, and it seemed to be such a great shoot. But then it was a terrific script. But then the financier fired the director, did his own reshoots and edits, and I've never been able to watch the movie. But our second movie, though, is Gran Torino, which is Clint Eastwood's most successful movie ever. So it's a business where you never know, you never know, you never know. And we were so lucky on that one. Just as unlucky as we were on The Flock, we were that lucky on Gran Torino. And our most recent film that we shot actually in Spain in Spanish. And now we call it a pre-make because we'd like to make it in English.
Yeah, I was watching the trailer for that, and I was like, I wonder, I don't know what's going on because I don't know Spanish. But it looks really cool.
Well, we weren't very helpful on set because we don't know Spanish either.
One theme that I'm realizing is reoccurring in this discussion, it's okay to ask for help. You can have someone come in, like someone who's a specialist.
Absolutely.
Or someone who can, you know. And I remember I've heard that, so there was a zine called Venus that was started in Chicago and then kind of migrated from a tiny little independently published thing into a bigger magazine. And the founder, Amy Schroeder, once said, DIY, do it yourself, it does mean doing it yourself, but it doesn't mean doing it by yourself. So
it's just as important to not just to know what you know, but to know what you don't know. And as you say, always ask for help. Bring in people, ask friends, because it doesn't matter where an idea comes from. If it's a good idea and it makes something better. And I mean, I've always wanted to work with people who are smarter than I, because they make you better. And I mentioned Paul Levitz earlier. When I came to DC at 28, he was 19, and he was a part-time assistant editor. But even though, as I said, there was fear and loathing that I had been hired, at the same time, all these men, because their livelihoods depended on my keeping them, they all wanted to anticipate what they thought I wanted to hear. And Paul was the only person who said no to me. And I thought, oh, he'll go very far. And so actually, he ultimately dropped out of school. I kept saying, I'll send you to school, I promise. I'll send you to Columbia Business School. And now Paul doesn't have to go because as someone who's self-taught, he's just terrific. But the fact that he said no and also had good ideas of why he said no, even if I didn't always agree with them, definitely made me better. And that's really what I wanted from everybody I worked with. And that's ultimately, I think what happened at DC. Over time, even this all-male company came to realize I wanted the no's as much as I wanted the yeses. But the one good thing about being a woman back in the day then, since, as I said, there were only 2 women on staff, one who was a secretary and one in production, when I needed to get away, I could always go to the ladies' room.
Yes! What kind of stuff did you guys talk about in the ladies' room? I would have loved to have been a fly on that wall. But by the time you left, there were plenty of more women at DC.
I'd say half the staff is female at DC now. I mean, there were 35 people when I came and 250 when I left, and half were women. And also we tried as much as possible to hire people of color and diverse backgrounds.
Is it still like that now?
I don't know. DC is going through a big upheaval now and is being moved out to Burbank. So.
And because I'm curious what your thoughts are on the way that the comics are moving right now.
I'm not as up on comics as I would like to be. Every once in a while, DC asks me to write an introduction for something. I just wrote one for Fables a few months ago, and then I reread all the old issues, and I read the newer ones. I'm like, oh my God, this is so good. But I read so many movie scripts that I don't have as much time for comics anymore. But when I'm asked to read something, I'm like, yes. And I once again feel that love of the medium, because it is such a special medium. And for those of you in the audience who are comics fans, you can just linger over a panel. They're so rich. There's so much going on. And it's a really intimate experience with a comic.
Sure. Is DC moving to Burbank because of movies?
Well, it's sort of. DC began to report to Warner Brothers, and there was always a kind of a move to get us to move, and we would say, no, it's such a bad idea. Publishing's in New York, and it will be so expensive also to move the staff, and you really don't want to do it, and then you'll lose the staff to Hollywood. They'll all want to be screenwriters. And for some reason, the corporate at Warner Brothers would buy into this year in, year out. But when I left and when Paul left, there was nobody there really to sort of throw his or her body in front of the oncoming train. And DC is now reporting to someone who's based in Burbank. So a few years ago, they moved a large part of DC, and now they're moving the rest of DC. And there's been a lot of collateral damage. A lot of people, of course, aren't going with the move. So it's been a hard time for the company.
Here's a question that you just triggered. Was there ever any creator person or any conflict that happened when you were there that you would have dealt with differently, or any conflicts that came up, or any regrets that you had, or anything like that you would have dealt with differently now?
Oh, I don't know, but when I think of conflicts, I think, and maybe if those of you who followed Superman might know that we killed Superman, and in a very, very protracted way over many months, and then we kept him dead for an entire year. And we, the day that Superman was killed, we all wore black armbands in the office, and then we did memorial tributes to Superman, and I always felt the best way to engage our readers was to torture them. And the way to torture our readers was to torture our characters. So Superman went through a lot in this year, and because of that, there were many news stories about the death of Superman. Bob Daly was the head of the studio at the time, and I think I was at a conference in North Carolina, and I get this call saying, Bob Daly is calling everywhere to find you. And I get on the phone with Bob, and he's like, did you really kill Superman? And I go, yes. And he goes, and you didn't ask me? And I'm like, Bob, we are going to bring him back. And I was in the corporate doghouse for the entire year. It would never have occurred to us to ask. And so it's about things you do or don't do. I was finally forgiven at the budget meeting because it was the most successful year in DC's history. But I'm thinking, when you say, would I have done it differently? I think if I had asked, he would have said no. So I'm glad that I didn't ask.
Ask forgiveness later. Oh, life lesson. That's kind of, and we talked a little, don't you guys remember when you were on the phone with all of us earlier? We had talked about that was sort of the Joss Whedon school of kill off the character, and that actually pulls in your audience more. So that's really interesting.
Right, because you had mentioned, when did we decide to kill off some of our characters? And I said, that's Crisis on Infinite Earths. And that was fairly early on. It was a great series with George Perez doing just extraordinary art, like somehow like angels on the head of a pin, getting like 1,000 characters on the cover of the book. But we had all these alternate Earths at the same time as Earth Prime. And so there were no consequences. Whatever happened in the comics, everybody could get resurrected one way or another. So we decided we would actually explode all the other Earths, have one Earth, our Earth, where everything counted. So if you had a death, as again, if those of you who might remember Crisis, we have Superman holding Supergirl's dead body in his arms and just screaming upward to heaven that Supergirl would stay dead. Now, ultimately, she didn't stay dead, but that happened after I left DC.
So what would you do if something, I'm totally changing the topic, because I am dying to ask you this, but I haven't articulated it in my head, so as it's coming out, I'm articulating. Okay, so how do you deal with, like, if a conflict comes up with a writer or art that, where do you have to draw the line if, like, this is too controversial, or this isn't going to fly, or, like, what if there's an editorial conflict between the creators and the publishers? What do you do?
It's not easy. That's a really good question to raise. As we were really moving into all this adult territory, we were doing some things that made a lot of people uncomfortable. And because, again, comics were thought of to be for kids, the sea change in comics hadn't been embraced and understood by the outside world. So we decided to label our comics. And we labeled those that were more sophisticated, suggested for mature readers. And the writers and artists were not happy. And they called it censorship. And we had a very, very hard time. And we kept saying, it's not censorship. We're actually protecting your comic book store, because they can be, and many comic book stores owners were, they can be arrested for selling material to underage readers. And there's a whole comic book defense fund to actually defend these store owners. So we said, we're not changing the material inside. We're just merely, saying this is suggested for mature readers, but this did not fly. We spent, several years at least, and with a lot of Sturm und Drang with our creators who felt we were censoring.
That's tough. That's got to be tough. Did anybody like switch and go over to Marvel because they were like,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, there was an exodus. We again tried to lure them back, and most of them came back. But it was, it's over the period of 27 years, there are lots of challenges. That certainly was one. We prided ourselves in our support of the creative community, and we thought we were supporting them, but they did not see it that way.
Yeah, that's got to be really tough to have to be in that position, to be like on the business angle of creativity. That's like artists are, and sometimes the business folk. It's hard to find someone who's both left and right brain to make it all meet in the middle.
Well, I mean, I say the comics are an art form, but they are a business too, and so you're right, you have to mediate between the two of them.
Sure. How are we doing on time? I know we were going to take some questions.
We are doing well. If we have about 15 minutes left.
Okay, great. 15 minutes for us to talk some more?
We have about 5 minutes to talk more if you'd like, and then we should open up to questions for 10 minutes.
Okay, well then, knowing that we only have 5 minutes left.
Fire away.
Okay, so what topics have we not hit that you would like to talk about? So we've got women in the world of comics, creators' rights, the transition from comics to movies, the some of the slides. Oh, we never talked about Sandman. All right, we're going to talk about Sandman. Okay, so all right, so Neil Gaiman, a lot of people know him from the world of fiction and what have you, but he was also the writer for Sandman. It was originally an old comic back in the day, and then brought back up around I don't know, what would we call this? I guess the Bronze Age of comics. I don't, whatever, like third wave of whateverness. So let's talk about some of the success of that series.
But Neil is one of the most talented people in comics and in fiction, even in movies now. Caroline is based on a book of his. A lovely, lovely person. I mean, really at DC we're so lucky because we worked with people like Grant Morrison and Alan Moore and Neil, who all of them with just such exciting intellects. And Neil is also, dare I say it, a mensch among mensches. And we were his first publisher in the United States because we did go to England, as we were talking about earlier, and Neil and Dave McKean were two of the people we met. And Neil was in his 20s, and we loved his work, we loved him, and his first collaboration with Dave, I think, was Black Orchid that we published, and Black Orchid led to Sandman, which, again, for those of you who are fans, you know it's just one of the best series in comics ever. And there's not much more to say except that Neil never ceased to amaze me, and if I go back and read any Sandman, or if I read Death, The High Cost of Living, I always think how terrific, a writer Neil is, and he's really a rock star in comics, and I think beyond. I think he's got more Twitter followers than most people, and it was a privilege to be his publisher.
Do you think that the advent of the social media world, do you feel like that's affected comics in some way that has made it a different type of experience than it was?
Well, comics I'd say maybe starting with Neil Adams and Denny O'Neil started to have stars, and Denny and Neil we're not of the generation where you had Facebook and Twitter and you could have followers, but they had obsessive fans, and I think today, if you're one of the premier artists or writers, and you can access all the social media, you can expand your fan base exponentially, and no one's more of a master of that, I think, than Neil.
Sure. You know what? There was one more slide we didn't talk about, and that was CAMELOT 3000. So this was important because,
well, we had always published, as other publishers had, single issue comics in a series, and then Nelson Bridwell. When I say we were a home for nerddom, I mean Nelson was one of the most socially awkward people ever, but but he loved comics, and Nelson really had a place at DC, and he came to me one day and he said, I want to do something called the World of Krypton, which was really to explore every detail of Superman's home planet. And part of the excitement, I think, and gratification of comics, especially serialized comics, is to create worlds, but then only to show certain parts of that world, and then to begin to fill in those parts that have to be, of course, consistent with the original parts. And it's a pleasure to kind of get to know the world better. And so that's what Nelson really wanted to do with Krypton. And he said, so I've thought about doing it in 3 parts. And I said, okay, all right, we'll do it in 3 parts. We will have comics first miniseries. And that's what the World of Krypton was. But then we found that if you sent it into Canada, if it was only 3 issues long, there was a penalty, a very steep penalty. So we said, okay, our next miniseries is 4 issues. And then we said, because it also sold really well, I said, if we could do a miniseries, why can't we do a maxi series? So CAMELOT 3000 is the first maxi series in comics. It was a 12-part story where the Knights of the Round Table are reincarnated in the future. And but they all, and actually one of them who's a man is reincarnated as a woman, but they still have the basic sort of character and foibles of the original Knights of the Round Table. And this was the first comic that we printed not on the 80-pound stock, glossy stock that we printed RONIN, but on better paper than the newsprint. There was a form of kind of newsprint paper called Bookstore, but it was a whiter sheet, and it was a little heavier, and the colors stood up on it. So we also said, okay, we'll take a flyer on CAMELOT 3000 because Brian Boland's art was incredible. And we said, all right, let's order some Bookstore paper and print it on that. And it was a wonderful series. People were so engaged with it. And then Brian Boland, who's one of the slowest artists ever, did not get in the next issue. And months were going by. And our fans were very disgruntled. But thank God for trade paperbacks, because now you can read all the issues at one time without waiting for Brian's next pages to come in.
Binging.
Yes,
Binging.
that is one of the things we also did that was an innovation in comics, because comics. I should back up. When I came to DC, all of our stories were plot-driven, and I said, no, we have to reverse the equation. All of our characters should drive the plot, and that's what we have to focus on. And that again made them more adult. You know, the exploration of character and character really impacting events. And once we started to do that, our artists and writers started to do real story arcs. And so we said we could collect the story arcs as trade paperbacks, which are somewhat different from graphic novel. A graphic novel is conceived as a beginning, middle, and end from the get-go, whereas a trade paperback is really the collection of a story arc. But they're bound with covers and what we talked about before, the perfect binding with a spine, so that you can read the title and you can put it on your bookshelf. And I think by doing that also, we introduced wonderful titles that people, let's say, who are just coming of age now can, if they missed Watchmen when it was published or missed V for Vendetta when it was published, you can, as Liz just said, binge read. You can read the entire arc, in a trade paperback, and you can have a permanent version of it. You can put it on your bookshelf as opposed to in a plastic bag in your basement. And that really opened up a whole new world of publishing and also of revenue for us. But most of all, I think the best part is for the reader, that you really can embrace an entire series or an entire story arc in one volume.
And also, one of the big things that were happening in Vertigo is that things were commissioned as graphic novels.
Yes, definitely.
As opposed to being commissioned to be singular issues, like The Dark Knight Returns is.
Absolutely. And what I didn't go to business school, and I didn't really know anything about business except this one maxim. I shouldn't say that because, as I guess proof that I knew nothing about business, on my first magazine, which was called Kids, which was all written and illustrated by kids for each other, it was this extraordinary critical success and an equally large financial disaster. And by the time I was 23, I owed $100,000 and knew everything about Chapter 10 versus Chapter 11 bankruptcy. But nothing teaches you like failure. And so the one business maxim that I knew, though, was that the railroad companies were said to have failed because they thought they were in the railroad business as opposed to the transportation business. And so coming with that maxim in mind to DC, I said, we're not in the superhero business, we're not in the funny animal business, we're not necessarily in the comic book business, we're in the business of telling stories in pictures and words. And by looking at DC that way, we were able to tell these really sophisticated stories. We were able to establish a Vertigo imprint. And I think that's was, again, one of the key things in terms of conceiving the company. It's what enabled us to usher in this new Bronze Age. Why not Platinum Age? Why are we going from gold to silver to bronze? It sounds like, you know, a declension.
And on that note, ladies, we have about 5 minutes left, and we can open it up at this time to the audience for any further questions. We have a mic on each side of the room, and we'll come to you. So, right over there.
Hi. I'm really interested in your transition from the comic book industry to the film industry, especially in light of DC's announcement of their consolidation in Burbank. With the boom of the comic book film industry, particularly with what Marvel has done and what DC is starting to do with the new Superman reboot, how do you see that affecting the comic book industry as they move forward? Because with so many people coming to these wonderful characters through film as opposed to the print books now?
The films have actually almost always given a boost, sometimes to the comics, not necessarily to the comics, but always to the merchandise. And we tried to work closely when I was at DC with the directors. Liz showed Arkham Asylum, a cover from Arkham Asylum, and Tim Burton, who was the director of the first 2 Batman movies, he had to meet with the different licensees, you know, with the toy company and with the pajama company, but he would hold up Arkham Asylum and say, "This is what I want my Batman movie to look like." So there has been a back and forth, and if any of you saw Watchmen in many ways is shot frame by frame from the actual comic. You can really see the layout, you know, exactly as it is, perhaps even too literally to the comic book. I don't know how much it's going to increase the base of readers, but it certainly increases enthusiasm for the characters. Sir? I think they're going to bring you a microphone.
What does DC stand for?
I was just asked, what does DC stand for? DC stands for Detective Comics, which was the first comic book, Detective Comics 27, in which Batman appeared. But it's kind of like Martin Luther King Junior High, because it makes us Detective Comics comics.
Second thing, if I may, how much were Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster paid for Superman?
I was just asked how much money Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster have made on Superman. And for those of you who have followed it, they were the creators of Superman. They made, for the time in which they created it, I think maybe the first year, they made $100,000, unheard of money in that time, because Superman first appeared in 1938. But they were asking for more rights, as I understand it, in their creation, and they weren't forthcoming, and they sort of were ostracized from the comic book community, and they didn't work for many, many years. And around 1975, they were destitute. And Neil Adams, who's an artist in the comic book industry, took up their cause. And I wasn't at Warner Communications yet, but you know, it was in the papers, and I knew some of the people at Warner's, and I said, how can you not treat these men better? But Warner's came to that same conclusion, if only for the publicity, and hopefully also some of it was, you know, a sense of right and wrong. And back then, they started to get their medical insurance paid, and $20,000 a year, but of course that still wasn't very much money. But over time, there's been this endless lawsuit, first with Jerry Siegel's widow, Joanne, and Joanne died a few years ago. But they have now gotten a great deal of money. Sadly, Joe Shuster never lived to see that money, but Jerry's family has. But it was a long time coming, I think in no small part because they would never settle, even though they were now talking millions of dollars. But I think it was really what kept Joanne going. And so they could have had the money much earlier, but it was a very, very protracted involvement with them.
And we can take one last question right here.
Hello. Hi, right here.
Hello.
Right here, right here.
Oh, hello.
Hi. You've described this like wonderful transformation that happened at DC as part of your tenure, and I was wondering what factors outside of your own role do you think happened, like influenced and allowed for this possibility of this transformation, and what factors in like other mediums do you think allow for this sort of wonderful transformation?
I was just asked what factors might have helped maybe outside factors helped the transformation of DC. And that's a question I actually am not sure of the answer to. We were certainly driven from the inside. I mean, I always, as I said, I worked with wonderful people, and we all felt this real sense of mission. And it was like being on the long road through China with Mao. We all were believers. And as I said, comic book artists and writers, though they didn't have a union, I interacted with them a lot. I could feel their discontent. I think that discontent was a factor. I think the Jerry Siegel, Joe Shuster case was very much a factor because it really put creators' rights front and center in the media. And I don't even know how we got to 1976 without creators' rights, but certainly after Siegel and Shuster and considering the discontent among artists and writers, perhaps we could have gone longer, but I think that those were factors that said, how can you step away from creators' rights at this point? Other than that, it's hard for me to say. The French albums, as I mentioned, they were very influential. I would look at these French albums, they were so beautiful. And I would say, why can't we publish these? Why can't we publish these? And then, and they were published, a lot of the art was published in a French publication called Metal Hurlant. And then a company here in the States bought Metal Hurlant and named it, its translation, Heavy Metal. And now this beautiful art was translated. And all these stories I thought were so incredible, because I didn't read French. Now I'm reading them in English and I think, wow, they're really not so good after all.
Although, for what it's worth, anybody who reads heavy metal and looks at the art, people aren't reading it.
It's true. The art survived translation. It was gorgeous.
All right. Well, I think that brings a conclusion to our program. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.